Hello, everyone, and welcome to MRI Safety Talks. I'm your host, Kellye Mantooth, and today we are starting a very exciting series on the ABMRS. And I thought for the start of this series, what better person to have on than Bill Faulkner? Bill, thank you for joining.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks for asking for me.
So to get started today, I want to start with a little introduction on you. How long have you been in this field? How long have you been doing MRI or been involved with MRI?
And next year will be 40 years.
Wow.
I started in late 1985, 86 with the first MRI system in Chattanooga, Tennessee. So I was the first one to sit in front of a console in Chattanooga. And I've had, like anybody in MRI, over the years, sold the imaging center. The radiologist sold the imaging center, went to work for the company that bought it. And then I went to work for another one of the doctor groups in town. Mm-hmm. And over that time, I've been doing MR education and operations consulting. Mm-hmm. And it's just been a real enjoyable career for me.
Yeah, essentially the sky is the limit, right? It's not just you get into being an MR tech and that's all you can do. There's so much more that you can expand past that. So right now, your current role with the ABMRS is that you're the chair of the ABMRS. Is that correct?
I am. This year will wrap that 2-year stint up. So I've been the chair for the last couple of years.
And you've accomplished a lot within the ABMRS. But before we dive into that, maybe you can give us a background. How was the ABMRS founded and why was it founded?
Well, Dr. Manny Canal founded the ABMRS back in 2014. I was fortunate enough to be asked to be on the founding board. Mm-hmm. And, in the short time that we were founded, we formed committees for each one of the exams. Mm-hmm. The ABMRS is the one that created those terms, MR safety officer, MR medical director, MR safety expert. And we set about creating credentialing exams for that. In fact, that's the mission of the ABMRS, is to credential these people that are, assigned the task of performing MRI exams and for the safety of the patient. Mm-hmm. Our first exam was in 2015. We had a couple of hundred people sit for that one, and it's grown over time, and that's kind of where we started and where we are today. Eventually we were all the exams were offered on paper. You had to be at a certain facility and little bubble sheets and that sort of thing. And that there were even some international exams done that way, but that's extremely cumbersome, expensive and not real convenient for anyone involved. Yeah. And so I think a major advancement that we've been able to do is get the exams now offered electronically. Mm-hmm. in testing centers run by Prometric, and there's over 250 or something like that in the U.S. And typically wherever you live, there's probably a testing center within a couple of hours drive from you, if not right in your own town. Mm-hmm. And so this, of course, allows you to take the exam anytime, pretty much that they've got a seat for you. Mm-hmm. So, you register through the ABMRS, and then it takes you over to the Prometric site where you'll pick a center and pick a time and a date. And, the other nice thing about this with the electronic exam, as soon as you finish, you'll know whether you were successful or not. Mm-hmm. And then a few hours after the exam, you'll get a report. And again, because of the capabilities through the Prometric site, you can get some feedback in terms of how you performed, kind of a unitless feedback, but how well you did in each of the domains, so that if you were not successful the first time, retest 60 days later and, have some time to study up. All of that information stuff's available on the ABMRS website. So I guess we'll get the commercial for the ABMRS out of the way there. But that's kind of, what how I've been involved and what we've been doing and how we've evolved in those years to now. Now we have over 3,800, getting close to 4,000 individuals in the U.S. credentialed by the ABMRS. We have probably several hundred international, which is, I guess, the other big thing is we're starting to offer the exam. The MRSO and the MRSE are now currently available in the UK, an international version of the exam. Yeah. And the MRMD will follow shortly thereafter. And so we feel that it's important we've had requests for this, and we feel it's important to expand internationally. So I think that's
I love that we're shifting to an electronic testing and trying to offer that internationally. So for anyone who doesn't know, previously, like Bill mentioned, when you would go and sit for these tests, it would be, 3 weeks, I think, before you would find out whether or not you passed?
Yeah. I mean, it was, easily 3 weeks.
Yeah. So now it's more convenient. You can go to a testing center and take it. And then, like Bill said, you get those results relatively quickly.
Well, certainly a pass-fail right then, right? Yeah. Just like if you were taking the MR Registry exam, you get it right then. And then you just get a little more detailed report a few hours later. I understand.
Yeah. Interesting enough that you brought up the MR Registry exam. So when the ABMRS was founded, do you know, was the ART exam, was it testing any on MR safety?
There were, over the years, I'm trying to remember the exact numbers. In the very first registry exam, when we took it back in the 90s, when it first came out, and I apologize for sniffing. It's I've got a autumn cold right here. We, some of us were kind of laughing at it. There were probably less than a dozen questions on safety, or if there were a dozen. I mean, there weren't very many. And a friend of mine commented to me, they said, well, it doesn't matter if you kill somebody, apparently, as long as you use an isotropic voxel, because there was all these questions, about how you calculate voxel volume and all that kind of stuff. And the safety questions were pretty softball. I mean, it really, didn't take much. This morning, I was answering an email for somebody, and I was going to send them the content specifications, and I fortunately went to the ART website. It's not a site I look at frequently, but I went to the ART website, and lo and behold, they have new content specs that they approved this year and will go into effect February 1st, 2025. Okay. And so I was going through the topics and kind of highlighting things that I wanted to. I've got a registry review course in 2 weeks. And so, so update, see if there's anything I need to update, and looking through the topics and stuff. But I noticed on the first page of it, there were, it listed the topics, and there are 21 questions now on safety. And so yeah, don't get too excited. And if you'll allow me here, I'm going to go over and call up this, here it is, the document, and bring it over here. Let me look at it. And just looking through this, for screening and safety, of course, it takes up one page. There's like four main topics on it. Implant and device research, I'm sure it's, again, very softball,
Yeah.
Identify the device, look up the labeling, and identify device-specific parameters. Okay, that's kind of straightforward. A little bit here about tattoos and body piercings, and level 1, level 2 MR personnel zones. They expect you to know that. They did add some stuff, it appears, terminology like conductive loops, proximity burn. That's a new one. They've never specifically mentioned bore wall contact. They've added magnetophosphanes. Ooh, okay. Anyway.
Is it safe then, Bill, for me to assume that the ABMRS maybe realized that there was an insufficient level of MR safety training within the registry and tried to fill that need?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. The MR registry is certainly not going to do it. There's, and quite honestly, about the interesting thing about this, I've talked to several radiologists, younger radiologists, and I've asked them, and again, I apologize, I just got the little sniffles going, and asked them about their experience in the American Board, ABR, American Board of Radiology, the board certifying exams for radiologists. And, the ABM or the ABR, their stance is that anybody that's board certified is qualified to MR, radiologist is qualified to run a MR imaging center. And these radiologists have told me there's not even a dozen questions on MR safety that they can recall. 5, 6, 7, something like that, maybe. And again, they, very softball questions. And that's just, unfortunate. That's really the main, or that is a reason for the ABMRS to be in existence, because, there's nothing on this MR registry exam that shows that a technologist, and I'm speaking from our standpoint as technologists, there's nothing that shows that person is, cognizant of MR safety procedures and policies and things that you need to be on the lookout for. As proof of that, look on any social media and look at the number of MR accidents, incidents that are reported. I don't even like the term accidents, incidents that are reported. And, especially stuff getting into an MR, into a room. I mean, how inept does site policies and practices, and how bad does it have to be so that happens? I mean, to me, that's just almost, it's the most common sense thing in MRI, but apparently sense is not common with it. So, I do think this is why the credentialing process of the ABMRS is important. And, I think there's a contrasting the two. Okay. I mean, obviously you and I are on the board. We can't speak to the content of the exam, but other than what's published on our ABMRS website, which if people aren't aware of that, there's called an exam syllabus that lists topics that one could expect questions on the exam. So that's certainly available. And, the big difference is you have this MR registry exam. And in this email that I was writing, this technologist that was getting into MRI and, just starting to do some scanning, teaching him the buttonology, which is, the way everybody tends to learn. And it's not a bad way to learn at first. But anyway, I was telling him that this exam, the MR registry exam, and I've used this analogy before. The MR registry exam is not a flight simulator.
Yeah.
The MR registry exam for the technologist does not test your ability to scan. It doesn't test your talent as a technologist in front of the scanner. It doesn't test your artistic ability to use all those parameters and how you modify for various scanning conditions, and it doesn't test that. It's strictly, and it's got to be, it has to be pretty top level, because it's got to cover things that are common among all scanners and types of scanners and field strength. So it's basically like playing Jeopardy. They'll give you a definition, and you name that term, what that definition is. So it's really a memorization process. The ABMRS exam is a credentialing exam. A credentialing exam is going to ensure that the person sitting for the exam has a deep understanding of not only the principles and in MR safety, the risk and the protocols associated with all these different environments, and how this knowledge is used.
Yep.
And one of the comments that I've heard from people, one person in particular early on, friend of mine, when he walked out of the exam, I said, "So what'd you think?" He goes, "Well, it wasn't a walk in the park." He said, "But it's clinically relevant." And I've heard that term more and more from people, feedback from the exam. It's clinically relevant.
Yep.
And that's the difference between a credentialing exam and one that's just going to test your ability to memorize terms and definitions. That's all well and good, but how you apply it is what makes you an MRI tech. So what the ABMRS credentialing is going to do for all of those, for the MRMD, MRSOs, MR safety experts, that what knowledge do you have and understanding do you have of that, and how that can be applied in the clinical situation that you're in. And that's why I think it's important for, from a safety standpoint. Now, I don't mean to ramble on here, but you asked me, so I'm rambling. The people, one of the problems in MRI safety is that there are standards, there are guidelines, there are concepts that are well known and well established in the field.
Yeah.
But in terms of actual enforcement of that, there's very little enforcement.
Yeah.
Enforcement's a tricky thing. It's in medicine, one of the things that kind of makes it difficult is, in fact, I was doing a safety course this past week, and one of the things that you talk about is risk, and medicine is not without risk. And the determination of whether to expose a patient to an MRI exam, in large part, is a risk-benefit decision, which is why the radiologist is kind of be right there with us for it. But the fact that there are risks, and so it's kind of hard to regulate something where the physician has to make risk-benefit decisions for the patient. Yeah. It's not a cut and dried yes, no. It's not binary. It's not a binary decision. And one of the ways then to increase the importance of MRI safety is for people to become credentialed. If you're passionate about this, and people get angry because, well, they ought to enforce this. They ought to make facilities do this thing. Well, not all safety mechanisms or the way things are done, work at every center. It depends on your setup and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But again, credentialing is what professionals can do. It's a critical step. But like I said, it ensures that you you have this deep understanding and know how to apply it. And it validates your knowledge and demonstrates that you can do this and that you've got a commitment to these high safety standards. It sets you apart from a professional that, knows what buttons to push and knows, how to modify parameters and things like that. But because there's always a risk, then you want to, in medicine, you want to mitigate those risks. And to do that, I think credentialing is a step in mitigating those risks. And it should provide assurance to your colleagues, to the patients and providers, that you're very much equipped to handle this very powerful modality with significant safety risk. I mean, it's a risky environment.
Right.
And I don't think, well, we're our own worst enemy when we talk about how safe MRI is, right?
Right.
But, if those risks, unfortunately, can just lay latent for so long and not noticed. And then when everything lines up, boom, you have a bad incident. And so, again, I think my belief, the way I truly feel is this credentialing helps ensure that we do a better job of providing a safe environment for the patients.
Yeah. So, you mentioned a little bit about the ABMRS certification credentialing, how that's different than ARRT. And you touched a little bit on radiologists, young radiologists reaching out to you, chatting about MR safety. What, I guess, encouragement would you offer to them? We know that like residency, or at least I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, residency, there are some residencies that have like robust MR safety training in it. And then there are some residencies where it kind of is non-existent. Is that an appropriate understanding on my end, Bill? It's kind of up to their discretion what they want to do with that.
Sure. I don't have any really firsthand knowledge, but other than just talking with some radiologists. I remember one radiologist that's the MR medical director of a large medical hospital facility here in Chattanooga. He was in an MR safety class a couple of years ago. And in introducing myself to him, I actually used to manage the MRI there at that hospital as my last real job some years ago. And this was way before he was there, probably before he was born, the way everybody's looking nowadays to me. But anyway, I was talking with him about him, and the joke was he was voluntold to be the MR medical director. And I understand he's still in that position. But within probably 2 or 3 hours of going through the safety course, a 2-day safety course, one of the techs that was sitting next to him turned to him and said, "So how much of this stuff do you all get in your residency, or in your training?" And he said, "Not a bit." I mean, that was his words, "Not a bit." I mean, they go over stuff, but I'm sure it's very top level.
Yeah.
And, the thing of it is, and this is, I think, a real worrisome point, is that in large part, MR safety in facilities is assumed.
Yeah.
Very top upper level management assumes nothing's happening. They assume it's going to be taken care of. You go down to the next level, they assume it's going to be taken care of by whoever's under them, and so on and so forth. And in many cases, it goes all the way down to whoever is directly in charge of MRI, from an operations standpoint, assumes the MRI technologists know what they're doing. It assumes that they're going to handle the safety things.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, I've seen that from radiologists as well. One of the last people, one of the persons in this last safety class, at the end of it, on her verification of attendance evaluation, she and this was an interesting. I did not know that she was attending remotely, so I really had no way to, talk with her, person to person. I mean, chat box and other stuff, but just not right in front of me. this lady was for all intents and purposes, a scheduler.
Okay.
She had no medical, no technology background. Mm-hmm. She was recommended this course by one of the by her technologist friends, because she's concerned, because in this facility that she works in, they have begun to offer MRI services by a mobile service. A third-party mobile company would come in and bring in a mobile. The technologist is essentially different every time, the truck rolls in. Mm-hmm. They rely on her to, schedule the patients, and if they've got any implants or devices, to look up the implants and devices. Aside from this course, I don't know what safety training she's had. She said she was extremely worried about the operations there, and was going to send a big lengthy email to her manager telling her why she's now concerned. Yeah. The radiologist, she said in her note she wrote me, the radiologist say to her something to the effect of, the techs know what's safe and what's not safe. So that kind of scenario scares me.
Yeah. How frequently, though, do you think that scenario occurs, or scenarios similar to that, Bill, where there's not really an onus of, this is mine and I'm going to say this is how we should practice to maintain a safe environment?
I wish I'd have thought to get some of these numbers for you. And I think it's, I have some, actually. Some years ago, it was actually we did it last year. We're going to do it again this year. And I don't think it's a problem to mention this, because I think it's conflict of interest here. I've done some work for many years with applied radiology. Mm-hmm. And we have done, myself, Kristen Harrington, Frank Shellock together have done MR safety webinars mm-hmm. annually. We're going to do another one, I think, later this year, or maybe we got things got in the way, and maybe it's going to be early next year. But mm-hmm. as part of the last one we did, we had a safety survey, and I forget however many people filled this out. A lot of people filled this out prior to doing the webinar. And it's amazing how many people don't have an MR medical director, don't have MR safety officers, not sure if they've got a MR safety committee. Policies and procedures are even not hardly 100%. Who's in charge? Who makes decisions? The results are all over the place. Mm. And it's really concerning. And again, unfortunately, there's just way too many facilities out there that are just assuming because I've not had any really big major yet, then we must be doing everything okay.
Yeah. That's scary. So given those numbers and how many assumptions are made about MR safety, Bill, what would you recommend to these facilities who don't have any of these personnel? If let's say you're a technologist in a facility like this, and you recognize that there's this gaping hole and we need to fill it, and there needs to be a captain of the ship, what recommendations do you have for them?
Well, you can write memos, you can express what you feel, let people know where you feel there are weaknesses in the mm-hmm. safety. Unfortunately, they may or may not listen to you. I read a quote, I forgot who it was attributed to, but some years back, that said it's hard to get someone to understand something when their salary relies on them not understanding it. Oh, and so, it's people look at what you can do to improve safety. For example, implementing appropriately and correctly implementing ferromagnetic detection. Mm-hmm. And I know you working in that field, it's like you see it, they'll buy it, that checks a box, but they don't use it appropriately.
Right.
I mean, if you don't use it appropriately, it's really can have even a negative effect.
Yeah.
But that's about all. Unfortunately, as technologists, I mean, that's really about all we can do if you can convince somebody that's got the purse strings, because again, they see this as an expense. Why do I need to expend an expense? We've not had an incident.
Yeah.
And so most of what I see when we get called in to do a site audit and risk assessment, in many times, it's not every time, but in many cases, it's been because there have been incidents.
Yeah. It's reactive instead of a proactive.
It's very much reactive. And what a lot of people do when they do reaction is we had this incident. What happened? Okay, they find maybe what it was that happened, so we change something that in that instance it won't happen again. In other words, they change something so that if all the stars align in the exact same way that they aligned this time, we'll fix it where that won't happen. But that doesn't address the root cause of it.
Yeah.
And again, it's because it's reactive. Most of the stuff that I've seen in years over, in MRI, particularly as involves safety, is reactive, and that's expensive. Okay. That's what's expensive.
Costly on multiple levels. Your equipment, if you're involved in litigation, your reputation, it's costly on so many levels to be reactive to something.
Right. I'm aware of a recent incident, relatively recent, a patient receiving a significant burn due to bore wall contact. And, it took several years to go through the legal system. And this burn was so significant that it was a full thickness burn all the way to the ulna. And this case just recently settled, I was told, for I don't know how much, but multiple millions of dollars.
Wow.
And that's just unfortunate that, the causes of this aren't obviously it was not in these people's training or processes to prevent this.
Yeah.
And the cost it would have taken to prevent it is much less than it would be to pay for the results of it.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree. So I want to transition just a little bit. We've been talking about facilities that maybe don't have robust MR safety programs. You mentioned earlier there are 3 certifications within the ABMRS. There's MRSO, MRSE, and MRMD. Maybe you can start from a top level. We'll start with MRMD because I see that as captain of the ship. And kind of explain what would be some of the incentives or benefits other than like knowing how to adequately provide care for your patients to being an MRMD. Like if you had a resident come to you and they're very green and they said, hey, like we didn't get a lot of MR safety training, should I consider getting certified with the ABMRS? What would you tell them?
Well, I would tell them that at least my understanding, the way it works in the U.S., is when a patient walks into an MRI facility, they become the patient of the radiologist. The radiologist is going to bill for the services that they provide. Therefore, they've got that contractual kind of a relationship with the patient to provide this service. The patient comes in for a procedure. We as technologists, we don't determine safety, we implement safety.
Right.
But the determination of safety is going to have to be that risk-benefit decision, which is kind of, it's not obvious in a lot of patients, but obviously when you have implant or device or some sort of an unknown item in the body, then that's when that gets more complicated. But just even in the routine practice, even even in a patient that has no implants or devices,
right?
The patient comes in again. They're a patient of the radiologist. The technologist is going to take that patient, going to look at the exam order. If the exam order seems inappropriate, they're going to go to the radiologist.
Right.
If the exam seems appropriate, they've got to actual order there. It's actually a requisition. I heard somebody, Dr. Howard Raleigh, I heard him say this one, but it's a requisition. They're requesting an exam. Mm-hmm. And so if everything seems to be, like it should be, the technologist is going to go ahead and go on with the exam. If something happens, the technologist has got a liability in that, because the technologist is also expected to provide the exam in a safe manner. Mm-hmm. But the technologist is essentially under the direction and supervision of the radiologist, because again, we don't practice independently. Right. And so it's kind of joined at the hip here, sort of. And so for my saying to the radiologist, if you're the captain of the ship, do you trust your pilots? I mean, because they're doing things for you, mm-hmm.
Under your supervision,
through your supervision in mm-hmm. Whatever capacity. Mm-hmm. And so that's why I think it's important then to understand the safety, and certainly if there's anything that doesn't seem to fall in line with routine, they're going to come to the radiologist.
Yeah.
And so, but the other thing I would say to the radiologist is, not only is it important for you to have an understanding of safety, but your technologist to have a really deep understanding of safety as well, because it's not unusual, nor do I think it's inappropriate, where in many cases the technologist, particularly if they're credentialed MR safety officer, having this knowledge and understanding, may know a little bit more of the minutiae details from a safety standpoint, mm-hmm. so that the radiologist can say, well, what do you think? And I go, okay, here's my opinion. Mm-hmm. And then they're going to have to proceed from there. If you want, I can give you an example of that. Radiologist called me up and said, I want to ask your opinion on something. Sure. It's worth exactly what you're paying for it. So he said, I've got a guy coming, I think it was a lumbar spine, and he had, and I'd never heard of this, but there's always something. He said he's got a MR conditional pacemaker, but it's non-functional. And he said, so, my question is, it's MR conditional, so does, you can follow conditions of use, but because it's non-functional, does that create any risk? And I said, well, let me give you my opinion on that. As most people are aware, when you have these MR conditional pacemakers, there are steps you take to place them in a particular mode. Most people might just call it an MRI mode. And there's some processes, minimal today, thank goodness, it's gotten a lot better, processes that are gone through to place this device in the MRI mode. Mm-hmm. Part of that mode is, yes, pacing the heart at a certain rate, but also part of that mode is enabling capabilities on this device to kind of put a safety net around it, if you will, for interference from the time-varying gradient magnetic fields, for example, in MRI. If this thing is not functioning, then you can't place it in that mode. And I said, my opinion would be, I would be concerned that if I couldn't place it in the mode, then I wouldn't have all the safeguards I would have if it's functioning. Right. And so, and I didn't tell him whether to scan it or not. I said, if you're just asking me, I think it presents a little higher risk. And that's all I said. I think the risk is elevated for that reason.
Yeah.
And so it's up to them then to make that decision.
Yeah. So let me ask you, if you can share this, was this radiologist a certified MRMD?
I have no idea. I do know that whenever we've been around his facility doing safety training for the technologists, he's been there. That's how I met him.
Yeah.
And, and it's kind of interesting when we do safety training on sites and things like that. It's interesting how many radiologists we don't see.
Just in general, working in MR.
Yeah, just in general. In general.
So do you think, Bill, if this radiologist, let's just say, we'll assume for this conversation that he wasn't a credentialed MRMD, Do you think if he was, that he would have had more insight or maybe thought differently about this himself? Is that what you would say that the MRMD certification does? Is it kind of teaches you how to think about things to mitigate risk?
I think so. I think he would be, I think he would, and for all I know, he is credentialed because he had that sense that something, this isn't different.
Yeah, yeah.
And then the other thing is you got to understand, so in this particular scenario, this radiologist, because this is not what he does, really doesn't have any direct knowledge of what goes into placing something in an MRI mode. Does that make sense?
Right.
So, in that scenario, but again, I think he certainly spent time studying and looking this up and researching it and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But I think that's what credentialing does. If you told me he wasn't credentialed, I'd be surprised. But
So what do you? Go ahead.
Oh no, that's fine. Go ahead.
What do you think might be the consequences of appointing someone as an MRMD without formal training? Let's just say you've got an MRMD or you have a radiologist who says, I've been doing this 20 years. I know everything there is to know. You can appoint me as the MRMD, but they're not credentialed or certified. Are there any consequences that you think would come with that?
I would say no more or less than not having an MRMD that, I mean, it's a name only, right?
Yeah.
Checks a box.
Yeah.
It checks a box. Does it really, if you've got, and it goes all the way down the line, but then you have technologists that aren't credentialed or studying that. I mean, he's named MR medical director.
Yeah.
Okay, great. But then medical director is responsible for defining the training, defining the policies, the procedures, right?
Yeah.
And then if you don't have anybody underneath that knows how to implement those policies and procedures, it's really no difference whether he's named or not named. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I mean, I can't see that it does anything. And there are sites that have MR safety officers, but there's really no MRMD. Or the MRMD is not involved. There are sites that have an MRMD, but they don't really have any MR safety officers, or maybe there's somebody named, but then again, maybe not. Again, it's got to be a fully functioning organizational plan for how to manage safety in an environment.
Yeah, it's almost like if you have one without the others, you have a piece of the puzzle, but you've not fit all the other pieces together. You don't have an entire puzzle. You just have one small piece of it.
Right. Yeah. And which does nothing to solving the puzzle, right?
Yeah. I'm very curious about these facilities that have an MRSO, but not an MRMD, because my understanding of an MRMD is, here, let me outline how I think we should practice safely. And then you, as the MRSO, you're on the ground and you're going to implement this, and you're going to be the one to say, hey, our policies and procedures say this is what we're going to follow. So it's almost like having an MRSO without an appointed MRMD is like, who is defining how we practice safely? Who do we answer to if there's some, I'm curious how those facilities, how do they operate without an MRMD, without an appointed MRMD to say, this is what we're going to do, this is the direction we're going to go?
One of the things, at least I've heard from attendees at safety courses and things like that, is that sometimes technologists are put in the position of, well, just do whatever you think's best. That's not an appropriate. That's not an appropriate approach, because as a technologist, I don't make a risk-benefit decision whether or not to scan a patient.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, and that's what I tell people to basically tell the radiologist is, I don't practice medicine, sir or ma'am. And that's a medical decision.
Right.
And so I don't know how. I mean, I think techs are put in sometimes awkward positions. And, the thing of it is that if you say no, if you turn an exam down, that can have negative consequences. Not making a decision is making a decision.
Yeah, exactly.
And to not perform an exam that may be very clinically critical for a patient can have detrimental consequences. And so I think a lot of times it doesn't take any, no, I've heard Manny Canal say this, it doesn't take any knowledge or education to say no. Right. And without this kind of knowledge and understanding, I think a lot of patients go underserved. Yeah. Because the easiest thing is to say no. And saying no does not eliminate the problem. Right. It doesn't really address the issue. Yeah. I want to bring up something, if I may. I don't know how long we've got here, but something that I think is coming down the road that people ought to be very interested in and on the lookout for. One of the things that has happened over the last couple of years is there's a very, very real lack of MRI technologists, lack of trained MRI technologists in the job space. Yeah. And this is, I think I've heard, with 75, 80% capacity, something like that. And this has really been an issue. It's been around actually for quite some time through service and other things like that, but it's evolved now into where you can scan remotely. Mm-hmm. And Dr. Canal wrote a paper and kind of defined it like this. It's kind of like the way some people use this is scanning with you. So, for example, you've got a technologist that's not real familiar with, say, how to do cardiac. So remotely, you've got somebody that knows cardiac, and so they can dial in and they scan along with this technologist to help them, and you can use it for training purposes, that's scanning with somebody. But in the remote scanning, when you're looking at, because there's a lack of technologists, then you're entering into this realm of someone scanning for you, again, to use Dr. Canal's terms, not mine. And when you do that, then who's going to be responsible for the patient, right? Yeah. Because you've got the technologist that's responsible for the scanning part of it, but then you've also got the responsibility of screening the patient, the implants, devices, if anything, positioning the patient, patting the patient, hearing protection, yada, 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 all that stuff that a tech does in addition to scan. So you've got somebody who's going to perform that function. Well, some will say, well, you need an MRI tech to do that. Well, if I got an MRI tech, then I don't need remote scanning, right? I mean, it's kind of like, yeah, like, okay. So, what a lot of people are, and these positions have been around for a long time. We used to call them like tech aides or something like that, where if you had one technologist and you needed another MR safety, MR person, which is what you need, 2 MR safety trained personnel there attending the patient. Well, you can use a technologist aid, and these people can be trained to, assist the technologist and help them with the functions that the technologist would do. And a lot of sites have been using these for many years, but, only as an adjunct to the technologist. So if you had 2 scanners, you could have a tech and a tech and a tech aid in between, something like that. But now with remote scanning, you could have a non-MRI technologist person dealing with the patient on the remote side. And that person's got to have a lot of safety understanding, as much as a technologist would. Right? Yeah. And so, Dr. Canal and I have been talking, and we've got with some other members of the ABMRS. And the ABMRS is now going to look at developing a credentialing exam for a position which we're going to call MR safety technologist, someone that is knowledgeable and understands principles of risk and is able to apply that knowledge clinically for the safety of that patient. Yeah. And so we think that is a need that, because it's going to happen. It's happening now anyway. Yep. So we've got to assure that this person that's charged literally with the safety of that patient. Right. I mean, that's their job, right? And so that these MR safety technologists, MRSTs, need credentialing. And so that's something, if you want to know what's down the line for the ABMRS, that's certainly something that we are actively looking at.
That's amazing news. Do you know, Bill, right now, is it too early to say, will there be, so the MRSO and the MRSE tests don't have any prerequisites. Joe Schmo from the street could go sit for those tests if he wanted to. I don't recommend it, but he could. But
they could sit for them, whether they pass it or not is a whole other thing, right?
And then the MRMD test, the only prerequisite for it is that you actually have to be a physician. Are there any prerequisites or is it too soon to tell for the MRST?
Well, I mean, if you take a look at it, if one were to develop an exam for an MR safety tech, then whatever topics of questions would be appropriate for this exam, it would seem to me like this person should have gone through some educational course that would provide them with this information. If you can, again, this isn't, operating an MR system, right. And neither is the MRSO, if you want to know the truth. Well, with the exception of, you've obviously got to know how to modify parameters and stuff. But so there, I think courses will be developed for this. It's, I would rather, got to do it some way. And I think starting with the credentialing exam, and who better to do that than the ABMRS, who knows about MR safety and MR safety credentialing, who better than that to set this standard out there that if you're going to be charged with the safety of a patient, this is what you're going to have to know.
Yeah. I love that. Bill, the great news to end this podcast. Thank you so much for coming on and talking about the ABMRS and just talking about MR safety in general with me. I'm very appreciative.
Well, it's been my pleasure. Thank you all very much for having me, and ask me anytime. Don't mind a bit.
I'll hold you to that.
Okay. Good deal.
Thank you all so much for listening.
Thank you. Take care.